Earlier today, I read a question posted on the internet about something that I had some opinions on. And this was pretty much what it was. The guy had what I think was a web application, and he had a page supposed to return some rows that would be displayed in a table. And the query was timing out before the page was displayed. So the guy had tried setting the connection timeout to a larger value. That didn't work. So he wanted to know what he could do to get this web page to work. Now you had to wade through the responses because the guy was not trying to do the right thing. He should have been using pagination. He should have been doing this. He should have been doing that. Why would you want to do it that way? And eventually some people answered his question. Now I think his question was a legitimate one for multiple reasons. A quick one is going to be, although I would be unlikely to do this with a web application, most of the applications in number that I write, not in quality or in complexity, I write for myself to discover something, to help me do something else that will result in a benefit to some user somewhere along the way. Sometimes those applications I write for myself are only going to be run once, or once I figure out all the issues, effectively going to be run only once, or maybe they're just going to be run so rarely they don't need to be efficient. I don't have to worry about performance. I may not have to worry about the impact of the inefficiency of that application on other processes running on the computer. You can't optimize everything, but these people who answer questions by dismissing them are not being very helpful. I find that all the time. I have a question I want to go get an answer to, which I can eventually dig up, but I've got to wade through all the insults to the questions, all the challenges, when there's an answer. It's okay to go ahead and say, here's the answer to your question, but by the way, you might consider it thus and so, but no, they're all insulting. And so I think it was a good question. And I have a different context where it's absolutely a good question, at least to raise that issue, and I want to discuss that here. Your application, let's assume it's a web application or a WinForms application. I'm always thinking in the context of Windows and SQL Server. Your application uses a provider or a driver as an intermediate layer between your application code and the database. And it has some properties. And one of them is the connection timeout. And the question is, if you don't establish a connection in this period, that provider or driver will throw an exception, which your application can trap. If it doesn't, it will crash. And so it's very often a good thing to be aware of and to set. That value is set in the connection string. Now, in the case of the fellow writing the question, the issue wasn't the connection timeout, because he had a connection. It was that the query was not executing and responding in a period of time, and the driver, with its default value, said, something's wrong here, I'm going to throw an exception. Now, in his case, it was not the situation that the query did not complete within a period of time, because that's not the relevant setting. There is a command timeout that is part of the SqlCommand object in .NET. I'm sure other environments have similar things. And the command timeout is a property of a SqlCommand object. And so if you create a new SqlCommand object, it's going to have its default. If you want to reuse that default, you might just reuse the SqlCommand object by changing the command text. And then they'll still have whatever value you set for the command timeout. Well, what is a command timeout doing? It is not measuring the length of time it takes to complete the operation in the command text. It is the amount of time it takes to get some response from the server. If the server can respond quickly, but not with all the data, and start sending rows, that satisfies the connection timeout. Other queries you might have require some aggregations or sorting from SQL Server, where it can't give you any rows back until it's ready to give you all of them back. So the nature of the query does make a difference, but it's not associated with the connection, and it's not associated with the time it takes to complete the operation when I get that first record back. Or the stream of information sent back may include something that I'm even unaware of. The TDS stream has various info messages. If there's an error, likely we're going to see an exception, but it also sends back a bunch of other information, other errors, that by default you do not see, but which you can query if you know how to look for them. So I want to discuss a context where this becomes important to me, and would be important to his question, because I'll describe a circumstance where even a perfect application that operates normally, and when it operates normally, is satisfying the command timeout. But where circumstances beyond the control of the application, or you, or anybody else, SQL Server doesn't respond quickly enough, even though it does almost all the other times. And in order to explain that, I'm going to digress again. I do a lot of digressions. I'm sorry. But this one has to do with the environment I was working with. And in this environment, all the servers were backed up by a product called Veeam, V-E-E-A-M. I know very little about it. Don't know how to set it up. Don't know a lot of details about it, but I'll tell you what I do know, which is relevant to my situation. Veeam can be set up to coordinate all the backups in your system, do it in an intelligent way, provide reports, monitoring, all sorts of amazing things. There is a free version of it, I think. And it also has an additional capability, which standard Windows backups don't have. It can back up SQL Server databases. Windows backups don't back up SQL Server databases because in most cases we have our SQL servers configured so that the database files are always open from the standpoint of Windows, and Windows backups, to the best of my knowledge, still don't back up open files. And it might be difficult to know what it meant if they did. So, we're running Veeam, one of these systems. Now, I took one of these systems and I wrote a service. And the service has no user interface, so I'm not concerned about a user having to wait. And what it does is it takes some information from another system running as a service called syslogd, that at least in our configuration takes all sorts of diagnostic information from all sorts of services and servers running across the system and puts them in a format where you can access things from a central location. You can access not only Windows and SQL Server messages, you can get things from Barracuda or whatever. That's really nice having it centralized. The bad news is that either because of the way our system is set up or the way syslogd does it by default, I don't know, don't care, it's beyond my control. It takes all the textual data that may be clearly segmented into fields that we might describe as normalized, and it concatenates them all into strings. And those strings cannot be simply parsed through a .NET string split operation. Some of them contain data that is further jumbled together, has to be decoded, and then maybe not even consistently between records that appear to be the same. And I wanted to analyze some of that data, so I wrote a service that is way too complex, in my opinion, for T-SQL. Couldn't put it in a trigger. I wouldn't put it in a trigger. I'd shoot myself before I put it in. And so I wrote a .NET parser that every once in a while looks to see if there are any records to parse, parses information, puts them in a different table. And it works pretty well. But occasionally, I'm not going to use the technical word stop. I'm going to say it ceases to do work. And if I look at the error log message in the Windows events, which logs errors from services by default, sure, it's highly configurable, could tell me more if I wanted to write my service to do more. But basically it's showing that something was wrong, and something, this service that's running fine for days, may stop. No, I said I wasn't going to use the word stop, because it turns out it doesn't stop. It hangs. It throws an uncaught exception that there's nowhere to send the exception to under my code. And so, setting the Windows service configuration in local services so that the application restarts when it stops doesn't address the issue, because the application isn't stopped, it's hung. It's thrown an uncaught exception. Well, why is this? Well, it turns out that I was able to coordinate some things through the use of some of these tools and discover that my service was having problems sometimes, not all the time, when Veeam was backing up the databases I was working with. It's not that the connections were dropped. It's not that the databases were taken offline. I don't really know what it's doing, but all I know is when I look in the Windows event log, I'll see that there is a period of seconds, not generally very long, sometimes it's longer, where the SQL Server is not responsive to anybody for anything. And that coordinates with the time that Veeam is doing some of these backups. They may be transaction log backups where they're very brief. If a user had an application accessing SQL Server and encountered this, very likely what would happen is that the application would take longer to respond than usual, but then it would respond. And you'd say, well, that's interesting. You would have a situation that could not be repeated by the end user to demonstrate it to somebody else, because they don't know all that's going on in the background. Don't know the circumstances and environment which caused it to time out in that case. Now, in that case, their timeout doesn't throw an exception. They have a connection to the database. They keep a connection to the database. The query is completed within the command timeout value. No exception is thrown. But if Veeam keeps that file or a SQL Server from responding for long enough, it will exceed the command timeout. An exception will be thrown. The service will stop. The user's application may crash if there is nothing caught by it. So what I'm trying to distinguish here is between a connection timeout, which has to do with how long it takes the connection to be completed. Your application and SQL Server to agree they have a path of communication. And the command timeout, which has to do with the amount of time it takes SQL Server essentially to acknowledge your SQL queries by sending something back. So, what do? Well, you cannot fix the command timeout in a connection string. That connection string is specific to this layer of the provider or the driver. You have to go into your application and set a property. If you're familiar with SqlCommand, it has a command timeout property in seconds, and you have to increase that. And you need to increase it to a value, in my case, and maybe in other cases too, depending on what's causing this problem, to a value in seconds that is greater than the amount of time it's going to take Veeam to do whatever it needs to do with SQL Server that causes the exception. So we have some concepts here. We have connection timeout, set it in the connection string. Command timeout, set it in the SqlCommand object. I imagine that the SqlCommand class is sealed. Otherwise, I'd suggest, well, just make a wrapper for it, inherit from it, and change the default property. I don't think you could do that. So you could make a wrapper for it and re-implement all of its properties to pass through to the command object and basically have one default value for all commands. In the absence of doing something like that, you're going to have to set a command timeout on all the commands. And you, as an application developer, can expose that as a property that is configurable outside of the application without having to recompile the application. That property will not be exposed in the connection string. It will be exposed in something like app settings or web config or something like that, where your application will read it, and then you'll take that value that it discovers at runtime and set it for, in this case, the SqlCommand connection timeout property. I actually thought I'd have a lot more to say than that about this, but that seems to wrap it up.